If you've ever stayed alone in an Airbnb, never ignore the faint knocking coming from inside the walls. I once thought it was just old plumbing, until I realized someone was knocking to let me know they were already in there. And the most terrifying part, the Airbnb host had never truly left the house. I never believed in ghost stories. At least, not until I spent 3 nights in an old house I rented through Airbnb. My name is Ethan. I'm a freelance photographer, and at the time I had been hired to photograph the forests in the mountains of Oregon. The nearest hotels were too expensive, so I booked an isolated wooden cabin with nearly perfect reviews. The host's name was Margaret. Her profile picture showed an elderly woman with a warm smile. In her welcome message, she mentioned that the house was over 100 years old and had a unique character. I assumed that was just a polite way of saying the house was old. I was wrong. When I arrived just before sunset, Margaret was already waiting for me on the front porch. Her hair was completely white, her body was thin, and her eyes looked far too sharp for someone her age. She greeted me warmly. "If you hear noises coming from inside the walls tonight," she said as she handed me the key, "just ignore them. Old houses always make sounds." I chuckled. Wood expands and contracts in the cold, right? She didn't laugh. "Just don't ever try to open the walls." Those words stayed in my mind long after she drove away. The house was quiet. Too quiet. There were no neighbors. No phone signal. Only the sound of the wind brushing through the trees. The first night was uneventful. Until 2:13 a.m. Knock. 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 A soft knocking came from the bedroom wall. 3 knocks. Then silence. A few minutes later, it happened again. Knock. 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 Jokingly, I knocked back. "Good evening." The knocking stopped instantly. I smiled to myself. It had to be the pipes. The next morning, I found a small piece of paper on the kitchen table. I was certain it hadn't been there the night before. It read, "Don't knock back." There was no signature. I assumed Margaret had come in with a spare key. Maybe it was her strange sense of humor. Still, it felt unsettling. The second night was worse. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Not on the floor. Inside the walls. The footsteps slowly circled around my bedroom, as if someone was crawling through a narrow passage behind the wooden panels. Creak, creak, creak. I pressed my ear against the wall. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard breathing. Very close. I froze. A few seconds later, someone whispered, "I know you're awake." I jumped backward. My heart nearly stopped. I turned on every light in the house. No one was there. The next morning, I called Margaret. She didn't answer. She read my message. 15 minutes later, she replied with only one sentence. "Don't listen to him." I immediately replied, "Who?" She never answered again. Curious, I decided to inspect the house. That's when I noticed something strange. Every room had unusually large air vents. I shined my flashlight inside. They weren't connected to air ducts. They opened into a narrow tunnel. A tunnel large enough for a person to crawl through. My stomach sank. That night, I decided not to sleep. I grabbed my camera and sat facing the bedroom wall. 1 a.m. Nothing. 2 a.m. Still silent. 2:13 a.m. Knock. 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 The knocking returned. But this time, it came from behind me. I turned around. No one. Then I heard a voice coming from the air vent. Soft. Barely audible. "Hello." I slowly lifted my camera. The lens pointed toward the vent. Something moved. A pair of eyes. Human eyes. Staring directly at me from the darkness. I screamed and stumbled backward. When I pointed the flashlight back, the eyes were gone. I ran outside and jumped into my car. It wouldn't start. The battery, which had worked perfectly that afternoon, was completely dead. My phone still had no signal. Then I looked up. Someone was standing behind the upstairs window. An elderly woman. White hair. Margaret. I thought she had returned. I rushed back inside. The house was empty. No one. When I reached the second floor, the room was deserted. But the dust on the floor revealed fresh crawl marks leading directly into the wall. Then they disappeared. I finally contacted the police using the satellite phone from my company's vehicle. They arrived almost an hour later. At first, they thought I was panicking. Then one of the officers heard the knocking. He knocked back. The wall answered. Not 3 knocks. Dozens. Knock, 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 knock. It sounded like countless hands pounding from inside the walls. The officers immediately tore down part of the wooden paneling. Behind it was a narrow passage. The tunnel stretched around the entire house. Inside were an old mattress, empty food cans, water bottles, clothes, and photographs. Hundreds of photographs. Every previous Airbnb guest. Pictures of them sleeping, bathing, eating. Every single one had been taken secretly through the ventilation openings. Someone had truly been living inside the walls. But the passage was empty. No one. The officers searched every inch of it. Nothing. Eventually, they found a small door leading into the basement. Inside sat a rocking chair, still gently rocking, even though there wasn't a breath of wind. The police contacted Airbnb. That's when they discovered something shocking. Margaret had died of a heart attack 8 months earlier. The house was never supposed to be rented again. Her Airbnb account had somehow remained active. Every reservation had been accepted automatically. My blood ran cold. If Margaret had been dead for 8 months, who welcomed me when I arrived? The investigation continued. Eventually, they uncovered another name. Walter, Margaret's husband. Years earlier, he had worked as a carpenter. He was the one who built the hidden tunnels behind every wall in the house. Old neighbors described Walter as an unsettling man. He enjoyed watching people without their knowledge. One day he disappeared. His body was never found. Police believed he had died somewhere in the forest, but they never proved it. I tried to move on. Weeks later, my camera files were finally processed. While reviewing the photos from my last night, I found one image I never remembered taking. It showed me sleeping peacefully in bed. The angle came from the air vent directly above me. In the corner of the photograph, an old man was smiling. Half of his body was still hidden inside the wall. The timestamp read, 3:47 a.m., 40 minutes. After the police had declared the house empty, I handed the photo over to investigators. They claimed it was probably a corrupted file or a digital glitch, but I knew exactly what I had seen. A few days later, an envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was a single worn piece of paper. The handwriting looked painfully familiar. Thank you for not opening the walls. Since then, every time I stay in a hotel or a rental house, the first thing I check is the air vents. Because sometimes, the monsters don't live in the attic. They live inside the walls, and they listen to every breath you take.